woman, it keeps me up at night. I keep thinking of this young woman killed at her place of work.
So Barkha, firstly, this is horrific. Not having to worry about your safety is just absolutely a basic right? Yeah. It should be, regardless of whether you want to work or you don't want to work, that's non-negotiable.
Bangladesh. Actually a sort of shining story of South Asia. The ousted Prime Minister is actually here in India.
In terms of spillovers to India, we see that as fairly small.
And at these numbers, you are forecasting that India will be the third largest economy in the world by 2027?
Yes.
Our newsmaker today here with us in India is the first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, Dr. Gita Gopinath. Always a pleasure to see you, have you back here in India. We're talking at a time when it looks like nothing is possible to predict in the world. We have so many global conflicts open. We have Russia-Ukraine unresolved. We have the situation in the Middle East. There is an anticipation of conflagration rising between Iran and Israel. In the context of all of this, how hellish does it look to predict the economy, and how worried are you?
Firstly, hi Barkha, it's always a pleasure to be with you. In terms of the global economy, yes, as you pointed out, there are multiple conflicts and geopolitical tensions growing in the world. We've come through a few years of, the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine that continues. But on the other hand, it is actually a positive sign that the global economy has shown the kind of stability that it has. So for example, we're predicting growth for this year at 3.2% and for next year at 3.3%. If you recall, it was about a year ago where everybody was worried about a recession in the US, and that would be a trigger for recession elsewhere in the world. Yeah. So in a sense, the world economy has shown surprising resilience. Now that said, you're absolutely right that there is tremendous uncertainty about the developments, including from geopolitics, including from important elections around the world, and also the fact that inflation still has to be brought down fully. We're not there yet.
Sure.
And we have a medium-term growth projection that's one of the lowest in decades. So we have a long-standing problem that we're going to have to deal with, countries around the world are going to have to deal with, which is how to raise growth.
Yeah. What is causing you sleepless nights?
But, we always wake up wondering about what might happen in the world and in this environment where there is so much tension and there's so much uncertainty. And given the fact that the last 3 years have been so unique, as an economist, I have to say that, it's hard to look at historical data and say, well, I have a fairly good sense of what might happen next. It's just been ups and downs and very different kinds of shocks. The pandemic was unique, the war is unique. And so assessing what will happen to the economy is tough. What that also means is that you could have financial market developments that could be all over the place. As you saw that recently in the US, you had a very big movement in the market. And by the end of the week, it had all unraveled, right? So it was all back to where it had started. So that kind of volatility and uncertainty is going to make you wake up every day and read headlines in the paper that say, well, is this something that's going to last, or is it something that's transitory and that's what we worry about?
But you're also in an election year in the United States, which always creates uncertainty. And then when you juxtapose that with all of the simmering global conflicts, some ongoing, some anticipated, are you at this point worried about the possibility of a global recession?
No, that is not something that we expect in our baseline. I think it would be a huge surprise if that happens. There could be obviously an event that triggers something going really bad. But as of now, that is not our baseline assumption. And if you look at in terms of probabilities or something like that happening, they are quite low at this moment.
Well, that's good news, I think, for everybody listening. But let's give an example from our neighborhood that perhaps if I'd been speaking to you 4 months ago, we wouldn't have been able to forecast. Bangladesh. Actually a sort of shining story of South Asia on how it had tackled with some of its socioeconomic challenges and so on. And then you have a mass movement on the street, student-led, the government topples, the ousted Prime Minister is actually here in India, and nobody quite knows what's going to happen in Bangladesh next. There's an interim government, led by Muhammad Yunus. When you look at Bangladesh, what does it tell you about framing policy in the context of uncertainty?
Firstly, in the case of Bangladesh, it is tragic, the loss of lives that has happened. It's people should feel safe in their countries, and this has been a very difficult time, and our sympathies are with all the victims. We have a program with Bangladesh, as you might know, and we remain committed to working very closely with Bangladesh. We're in discussions with the interim government. We will work with whichever government comes to power next. So we are there fully to support Bangladesh and its people. These kinds of developments happen around the world, and we see them in several other parts. It's too early for us to tell you exactly what the impact of this is going to be for the economy. It's something we're going to pay close attention to. In terms of spillovers to India, we see that as fairly small, even though there are some trade links that might get affected, but it's not a big spillover to the region. But that said, I think, again, countries around the world should anticipate that in a world where after economies have gone through the kinds of large shocks that they've experienced, again, I'm not speaking about Bangladesh, but I'm just stepping back and talking about countries more generally. We've seen many countries that have what we call scarring, which is that while they've recovered, they've just not fully returned to where they would have been in the absence of the pandemic. And that creates hardship. Governments have limited resources to deal with the problems. So that you can have unrest of many kinds. Again, not talking about Bangladesh here specifically.
Let's come to India. The IMF forecast for growth at 7% has been even better, as has been pointed out, than India's own economic survey. What makes you optimistic about India's growth story?
Yeah. So the 7% growth is firstly a reflection that the last year growth turned out to be much stronger than we had expected it to be, and so there are some of those carryover effects. Secondly, we are seeing private consumption recovering. Last year private consumption growth was around 4%, driven by weakness in consumption in the rural economy. And that was also a reflection of weak monsoons and weak harvests.
Yeah.
Here we're seeing an improvement in rural consumption. If you look at some of the indicators for this year, we're seeing that, for example, if you look at two-wheeler sales or these fast-moving consumer goods, which are usually indicators of recovery in rural consumption, we're seeing that happening. But again, of course, we have to follow the data closely and see what happens over time. But we expect to see private consumption recover alongside continued public investment, which has been one of the main drivers for growth.
And at these numbers, you are forecasting that India will be the third largest economy in the world by 2027?
Yes.
And that's, of course, at these numbers. And we live in uncertain times, but fingers crossed that it is as you say. But the big challenge, along with these very sunny, optimistic, robust growth numbers, is that of employment. Now, you have said that India would need to create anywhere between, 60 million to 148, am I saying it right? 148 million jobs before 2030. The economic survey talks about needing about 8 million every year, 8 million additional jobs. Your number would peg it at anywhere between 10 million to 24 million every year before 2030. What worries you about not just unemployment, but underemployment, which doesn't get talked about enough?
Yeah. So firstly, in terms of the size of the economy, I think it's important, as you also point out, which is what brings up living standards is per capita income.
Yeah.
And of course, that is a bigger challenge. And the Prime Minister has talked about Viksit Bharat 2047 as a goal. But that's where we really want to see the action, is in terms of per capita income rising. The job situation in India, India actually is, if you look at among its G20 peers, India is a country where growth, if you look at the last decade, about 6.6% growth. But if you look at employment growth, it's been under 2%. So it's been a lot more capital intensive growth than in several of its peers. And so it comes down to the question of how to change that and how to create a whole lot more jobs. There is, this debate that is going around about which sectors can we stimulate and which, should it be manufacturing? Should it be services? What should it be? Frankly, if you want to create an additional 60 to 148 million jobs, you really do need broad-based growth in all the sectors. So the areas where, there's what can be done in a shorter period of time. There are what will take a longer amount of time. So in the near term, improving the ease of doing business, there's been a lot of changes, but still, there remains the case that if you can have dealing with regulations, compliance, even on the tax front, red tape, all of that, the less hassle it is, the more you see in terms of investment going in. And so states like Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, for example, seem to be getting a lot of interest, including from foreign investors, because of the positive business
What are they doing
climate.
right or different from others?
So it seems that there is, though there may be constraints in the actual formal mechanisms, there seems to be solutions in the sense that the bureaucracy is able to deliver faster solutions to move things along. So that's what we see. Secondly, I think it is absolutely critical to have more flexibility in the labor market. Labor laws were passed in 2019-20. They still need implementation, and that's going to require working with the states to make that happen. Public investment, which has been very strong in India, will need to continue because there's a lot more that needs to be done. And lastly, this is an opportunity for India because the world is looking at India as a country to diversify into, right? Given the geopolitics, India, in fact, benefits in a sense from the fact that countries are saying, well, if we're going to diversify out of others, we'd like to move into India. So it's a great opportunity. But to be able to do that, you have to see India as open to trade.
Yeah.
Because to be a part of the global supply chains, you should be willing to freely be able to import your inputs that you need so that you can export your final products. Right? So that's another area. But for getting to much higher levels of per capita income, it's going to start with much more investment in human capital, in education, in skilling. It remains the case that when you talk to companies, that they talk about the skill mismatch, the lack of enough skills. And it's true. If you again compare India to its peers, in terms of the number of years of formal education of its workforce, it's lower than its peers. So investing in human capital, education, and health, all of that is super critical.
How do we understand, though, the paradox? As those of us who are not economists, we look at these soaring growth figures. We look at India sort of being almost like this island, at least in South Asia, sort of an island of relative stability, politically, economically. And then we look at the unemployment or the underemployment numbers. And, for young people, this has been a simmering big issue. We've had it be a major talking point, even in our recent elections. And without drawing you into the politics of anything, how do we, as an economist, how do you understand this seeming paradox? Great growth story, but a real challenge of jobs and employment.
In a sense, it's not a terrible paradox. Firstly, as you said, we should recognize that India's growth, by any standard, is impressive.
Yeah.
It contributes a large amount to global growth. It's a significant amount of global growth. So again, given everything that country has had to face with, coming out in its form that it is really quite impressive. Now, a bunch of that growth has come from public investment, which was absolutely needed. Without a doubt, you need public investment. So a bunch of metrics have improved. There's a lot more public investment happening. The financial sector is in a stronger position. Corporate balance sheets are in a stronger position. But then, yes, then there is this question of a lot of this growth is coming without enough job creation.
Yeah.
And there is where I go back to the same issues, that if you look at investment in India, while household investment and real estate investment is doing very well, corporate investment in, say, machinery and equipment is not doing as strongly. Now, this may take time, and maybe this is where the beginning of a string of recovery there. But again, anything that can be done in terms of ease of doing business, what can be done in terms of not taxing labor, indirectly by making it labor market so inflexible, all of that will help workers. Human capital, skilling, all of that is going to require concerted effort.
Amid this entire sort of debate about the growth story and jobs is also a very big debate about inequality. And while it is, of course, true, and the data shows it, that there have been a large mass of people that have been lifted out of poverty, the inequality debate in India rages on. And the world has also jumped onto this bandwagon. We have Thomas Piketty and the World Inequality Lab. Even they had a report that said India was more unequal today than in the British Raj. Now, maybe that's clickbait, but how do you look at the inequality debate in India?
Yeah, I think the debate that's very important to have is in terms of creating high-paying jobs for the vast majority of Indians, and that is going to be tied to any discussion of inequality. If you can create enough high-paying jobs, then you automatically are going to attenuate the inequality gap, and that's going to help everybody, right? Frankly, I would hope to see better data, being able to look at better data to be able to make the assessment of exactly what's happening with inequality. But I don't think we need to do any of that. I think there's a clear recognition that there is a need for a lot more job creation. And if you can accomplish that, then you're going to deal with the inequality issue too.
There's one developing space that could be a challenge to jobs, and that is AI. And I've sort of read your work on this, I've heard your talks, and you have made the point that it could take a sort of normal downturn and turn it into a full-blown crisis. I know the IMF is working on AI dashboards to look at how different countries are coping with the new challenges thrown up by AI. I think some numbers that you have crunched suggest that this could hit 40% of jobs worldwide and 30% of jobs in India. How do you look at the challenge from AI to jobs, specifically in the Indian context, but of course also globally?
Yeah. So it is, we are in early days in terms of what actually we might see. So there's a fair amount of uncertainty in terms of the impact. But yes, this is now, viewed as a general purpose technology, like the steam engine, like electricity. There is the potential for this to be truly transformational.
Yeah.
And if that happens, there is about what we say on average, about 40% of the jobs in the world that are exposed to AI. That doesn't mean it's all bad. Some of it is complementary to AI, but it's about half and half. That's complementary versus substituting workers. In India, it's about 24% is, I think, the exact number for the exposure to AI. It's a smaller number because the vast majority of Indian workers remain in agriculture. So it's not really being affected by the generative AI in terms of being labor displacing. And of that 24%, about 10% is labor substituting. The question is how quickly will AI be absorbed into our normal lives and into work, right? And we created this index of AI preparedness, which has 4 factors, which is one is level of digital education, human capital. The second is the ability to innovate. Entrepreneurship, like how vibrant is the economy, because you're more likely to bring in new technologies when you do that. The third is what kind of regulatory environment that you have to make sure that people actually, it's used safely, right? And the last is whether you have the appropriate digital infrastructure. So if you look at that, India comes somewhere in the middle. So I would say it's at an intermediate level of AI preparedness, slightly above the average for emerging markets. But again, one of the indicators in which it really needs to cover a lot more ground is in terms of the human capital, digital skilling gap that it has. So it comes back to the questions you raised earlier about how do we create jobs. It's going to require a lot more investment in raising human capital. And that's the only way that you could benefit from AI and also make sure that you're complementing yourself, workers, and not substituting workers.
Interesting and uncertain times. Towards the end, I want to ask you about something that matters a lot to me, and I know it matters a lot to you, how to bring more women into the workforce. Now, when we look at the female labor force participation numbers in India, the economic survey out this year puts the number at 37%, which is actually a big improvement, but most of the spike is coming from rural India. When you look at the urban numbers, the number is much lower at about 25%. I ask you about this because women face multiple challenges, societal, but also those of safety. And I ask you this question at a time when all of us in the country are very disturbed at the rape and murder of a young doctor, female doctor in the city of Kolkata. And again, gender is a universal debate. Sexual violence against women is a universal challenge. I'm not interested in the party politics around it at all. But as a woman, it keeps me up at night. I keep thinking of this young woman killed at her place of work. And I think how this will have an impact on other women who are already battling so many odds to come into the workforce. And I really want to know your thoughts on this.
Yeah. So Barkha, firstly, this is horrific, right? I've also been reading about it, and as a woman, it's, among the things that keep one up at night is events like this that happen anywhere in the world, because it reminds you also of your own, I grew up in India. I was a young student in India, traveling in public transportation and so on. And there was the fear of what might happen, right?
We all went through that.
We all went through that, and so it's really terrible. So I mean, for me, you're absolutely right. The workforce, to have women in the workforce, absolutely, without a doubt, it's important to have a secure place, security of transportation to your workplace, just the feeling. But frankly, even without that, not having to worry about your safety is just absolutely a basic right? Yeah. It should be, regardless of whether you want to work or you don't want to work, that's non-negotiable. It has to be absolutely something that you can, it is a right for you. As a woman, you absolutely should have it. And, and yes, putting my economics hat on, the levels of female labor force participation in India, very low. And that has to go up. And there is no way that will happen if women in India do not feel completely safe. So, I am pleased that the Prime Minister, in his speech on Independence Day, actually made a very pointed reference to the importance of the safety of women and taking speedy action against such cases. That's absolutely critical. And this has to happen on a war footing to deal with it.
And there's also the entire sort of challenge of unpaid work that women in India go through. But safety, as you said, is non-negotiable.
Non-negotiable.
And thank you for saying that, because I think more and more of us need to say that. On a happier note, you're back at your old institute, D School, as we used to call it, the Delhi School of Economics. Big milestone, lots of nostalgia.
Yes, totally. Totally. It's 75 years for D School, and it's 30 years since I graduated from Delhi School.
Where did the time go?
Exactly. So it's wonderful to go back and just remember all the professors who I'm extremely thankful to for providing me my foundation in economics that I used to do anything that I have done since then, and the friends that I've made. In general, frankly, the fact that we got this fantastic education in India at incredibly affordable prices is something that is quite special.
Gita Gopinath, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.